Well, 2 days of the Central European Rally of the part of the world, the penultimate round of the World Rally Championship 2024. Well, next week, from the 21st to the 24th of November, the World Rally Championship 2024 season is coming to a close, and we'll have a champion crowned. Who will it be? Look out for that right here on KBC Channel 1. But right now, let's get straight into one of our conversations, a volleyball conversation. Not able to complete that as Coach Paul Bitok not able to do that. Let's see. Let's move on to the second conversation that we are to be having. And this is the science of anti-doping. And before I introduce our guest, our sign language interpreter is Lensa Odingo. Joining us is biomedical scientist Gerald Luande. He has worked with some of the top athletes in the country and some of the top projects around athletics in this country, and not just from the competitive side, but also this is from the anti-doping side. A very good morning to you, Gerald.
Good morning. How are you today, Wahome?
I am very, very well. And, as we would like to get into the science of anti-doping, just a background is that we know that the anti-doping fight is defined in the WADA code. There is the legal process. We know that is where, people are told the do's, the don'ts, and these are some of the sanctions that may come through. But there is also the science part, and this is where we try to look at the substances and where involved methods. And straight looking at it, what are some of the things that you have seen change over the past 8 years since the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, was fully, the law was enacted, the agency came into full force, and the work that they have been doing in terms of, collecting the samples till a date where we got an approved laboratory to do blood test, the tests on bloods, and this is towards the athlete biological passport, which we'll get into more detail soon.
Okay, so thank you very much. As you've correctly put it, anti-doping is made up of two main components. One is called the process, and the other one is called the method. So methods can also include the substances. So over time, Kenya has tried to align itself with the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is the global governing body. And along the way, the Athletics Integrity Unit, which is a subsidiary of World Athletics, also came into being. So Kenya being a powerhouse of athletics, we are mainly aligned to Athletics Integrity Unit.
Okay, now coming into this, now let's talk about one of the areas that came up, and this was introduced not as recently as people think, but it was, we are talking close to 15 years of it now, the athlete biological passport. What was the concept of having the athlete biological passport, to keep track of an athlete's profile of blood and the things that you look for whenever you are doing these tests?
So thank you very much. I'll use the analogy of a classroom. So if you have many students in your classroom, you might not know every student's detail at any given time and point. But over time, you give them cards and you create like a mark sheet. So the first card, the student one got this, student two got the other. Then you can draw a trend of your students to know which student is improving over time and which student is declining over time. So the same analogy can also be used in athletics. Since there are so many athletes at different levels of capabilities, some are platinum level, others are still amateur athletes, it might not be easy to tell all the specific details about a single athlete at any given time point. So the concept of athlete biological passport was to create a database of biological parameters associated with each athlete over time, so that whenever there's a spike, the regulators or the anti-doping agencies can know which athlete needs more attention, because that spike could be indicative of something, or it could be a fact that the athlete might have engaged in some anti-doping rule violations. So a case in point is athlete biological passport on recombinant human erythropoietin. So recombinant human erythropoietin is the commonly used product among endurance runners because it helps them increase their blood cell count, and by extension,
so, Gerald,
allows them to...
Gerald, this is what everyone knows as EPO, to make it simple.
Yes, that's EPO in simple. I was just calling it by its scientific name because there's a reason why I use the scientific name. So So EPO is the most commonly used product, and EPO naturally is produced by our kidneys. So you'll find patients who are going through dialysis who have a failing kidney will get EPO given to them to help them produce more red blood cells. But now athletes naturally are healthy human beings, so they produce EPO naturally. But in the event you begin taking EPO from outside exogenously, we call that EPO recombinant human erythropoietin because it's external. It's made through the laboratory, so to speak. So it is easy to tell an athlete who has used this product by looking at their specific parameters. So let's take an example of you walking into any hospital. So if you walk into any hospital and they tell you to do a test called a full hemogram or a complete blood count, it will show us your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets. But now that is the three differentials that are mainly looked at. But now for athletes, we do 5 differentials. And among those other differentials, one of the things we look at is called reticulocytes. So reticulocytes is an indication that this athlete is producing new red blood cells. So the question is, why are you producing new red blood cells? Is it that you went to train in altitude? Is it that you've changed your diet? Or is it that you've used a banned substance? So that is when now it becomes, we move now to the actual test, because biological passport is more of an indirect testing. It's not really saying you've used EPO, but it's giving a likelihood that you may have used EPO. So following that, we can now take your sample to the approved laboratory and tell that actually we found EPO in your product, whether it's in blood or urine, but mainly in urine. So that's why you'll see most of the time they'll take both the blood sample and the urine sample.
So, and in this case, let's just take a look at where somebody is using this, because by the time you develop this profile, like you mentioned, the case of a student's performance in school, where you look at, if they're improving, if their grades are improving or if their grades are dropping. But there's somewhere where you've mentioned a spike. In the case of a student, you may say they probably cheated in the exam. But how long does it take to build this profile of an athlete such that, you can now start looking at probably doing more investigation into whether the athlete is using a prohibited substance or a prohibited method?
Okay, so that is dependent on the duration of the athlete's career, because if at all you've been a professional athlete, let's say for 5 years, and you are being sampled every quarter, so it means every year we get 4 different values of your blood differential biological parameters, as we'll call it moving forward. So after 4, we'll have an average. We'll know, for example, hemoglobin, which is the most common thing that is looked at. If your average is 16, we know you should be either in the neighborhoods of 16, so either 15 point something or 16 point something. But try to imagine a situation where this athlete shoots from 16 to 19. You'll begin questioning what is happening. And the inverse is also true. If the athlete moves from 16 to 12, you'll be like, did you stop using something, or are you unwell or something? So it creates a dichotomous kind of situation for the athlete. So to answer your question is, you need an average of at least 4 to 6. So this 4 to 6 might not necessarily be in 4 quarters. It depends on the frequency of sampling. So sometimes, let's say if you have competitions close together, like mostly our 10,000 meters downwards kind of athletes, then and they have their competitions very frequently. So nearly before every competition, there'll be a sample collected, and based on your performance, immediately after competition, there'll be a sample collected. Then there will be also out of competition testing. So depending on your level and the frequency of testing, we are able to get a better trend. And the more the time points, the better for the analysis.
Well, just looking at some of the decisions that have been made, and with also reference to an interview that I had with the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, is then how do you use this to educate athletes so that they know that this is what you're supposed to do at this time, this is not, you should not do at any one time? How do you now transfer this knowledge to the people who are running and in case of other sports that may be running the same athlete biological passport, information that they need to keep?
Okay, so your question has two parts. So the first part is education and the other part is the information to be kept. So maybe I'll start with the information to be kept. So most of our blood parameters shift every day. I don't know how my hemoglobin was yesterday and how it is today. So naturally, it's not easy to tell off your mind as an athlete or as a human being that my values have shifted unless the decline is very significant. And that is why even the athlete biological passport allows an allowance. And for every result, anytime you walk into a clinical lab, you'll be given a range where you're told your value is 16, but your range is, let's say, between 12 to 18. So as long as you're within this range, there's nothing wrong. You are a healthy human being. So it's the same thing with athletes. If we've known your average is 16, but the range is between 12 to 18, we will need to monitor. When it goes range, what is the second part, which is on information. The first thing, normal, and in case you are to be approved by, in Kenya, there are approved doctors in many. They must pass any medication. What is not just limited to EPO. It can be used for other products. Now that we are getting into sprinting, like testosterone or growth hormone or those kind of things. So any athlete must always reference whatever product they're using with their teams. If at all you are using any supplement, that's because we've learned over time that some supplements are less, and that's why WADA and its affiliates have a platform where athletes can search for any supplement they're using to see if at all that batch is an approved batch. Because you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you say, I took this product and I didn't know what was in it. The other thing is we need also to understand as athletes and athlete support personnel that hemoglobin is not the only factor of good performance. There are many other factors, because you might have a good hemoglobin, but your muscles are weak. So as an athlete, you must be an all-rounded person in terms of your training, and you don't over-anchor on this particular parameter as the only standard, because the fear has been that if, let's say, you're training with somebody and you overhear, sometimes wrongly, that guy has a value higher than mine, then you might begin being tempted. And that is the kind of situation where we don't want athletes to find themselves in.
Well, very interesting that you're bringing the difference between sprint and middle versus long, because we've had, I think we'd have to go back to 2021 when one of our top sprinters, was sanctioned, and this was at the Olympic Games, and the reason why there is a shift in the way it is tested, and also the issue of supplements. Overall, what are the learnings that have been picked up from the cases where our athletes from Kenya have been sanctioned because of the athlete biological passport, and what they need to understand, because it's very technical, but you've tried to make it as simple as possible. It's extremely technical if you are to say it, but how would you communicate? How are you now trying to communicate? I mean, I know it sounds repetitive, but how are you trying to communicate to these people so that they understand that everything they do is, does not affect them? Change of altitude in terms of training, which may raise your hemoglobin level, oxygen intake levels, maybe moving to lower lands at times for competitions, especially for those who do the half marathons or the middle distance races. How do you balance your body? How do you keep checking and ensuring that you're within limit all the time?
Okay, so the first thing is maybe let me distinguish the two sports, which is the long distance versus the sprints. So for the sprints, and that was the case of Marco Tieno, the unfortunate situation was prior to that Olympics, majority of the athletes we were sending to the Olympics were distance runners. So maybe, I'm not very confident about this, but maybe the panel that was used might have been the one for distance runners. But here's a situation where you have a sprinter with a totally different variables of interest, biological parameters of interest. So we need to customize the kind of testing and databases we are creating for athletes based on their sports. And this is anchored on the World Anti-Doping Agency code, which is always revised every year, because there's some products that are reintroduced and others are removed. So athletes must always be up to date with this. So they might not be able to read the entire WADA code, but there's always a summary of the WADA code, which their athlete support personnel, be they doctors, coaches, or anybody in the know, or our anti-doping agency of Kenya, can keep updating them with these emerging technologies. The other thing is outside the types of sports, the other thing is for athletes, anytime you are going for any testing, you must give a genuine history of what has happened since the last time you are tested. So for instance, if you change the altitude, you need to indicate that. If you changed your diet, because sometimes you might go, let's say if you're a sprinter, you go to a country where the meat is laced with growth hormone, and the growth hormone that is there is not the natural growth hormone that we find in our bodies as human beings. So if in case you eat that meat and you are sampled, they might find you are high on such kind of hormones or even testosterone, and you might be banned for that. There's even a case of a Kenyan in Mexico who found himself in such a situation. So the trick around this is always update, because any person involved in that testing mechanism might know that in this particular situation, maybe this person might have consumed less meat because we've had such kind of cases before. And lastly, on the supplements, to always get approval for any supplement you are buying. Don't just buy it over the shelf. And also there are certain supplements that are allowed within certain jurisdictions. So for instance, the way our athletes travel around the world, you might go to another country and buy a product which is allowable in that country, but not allowed in our country. And that also introduces a new dynamic. So anything that you're using, be it a supplement, whatever, just disclose to the anti-doping testing agents. Thank you.
All right, Gerald, we'll be taking a short break and we come back to you, because we'd like to see this new dynamic when it comes to sprints and what people should know. The case of Mark Otieno, because we know we've got Ferdinand Omanyala, we've got Mark Otieno, we've got Wiseman Were. So we are seeing the sprinters coming to the fore in the Kenyan scenario, which means that there is a shift in the way this is done. And also the case of supplements, diet, and culture. Well, we'll be coming back to Gerald Lwande after we take this short break. And welcome back to Sports Check on this Monday morning, the 11th day of November 2024. It is a day when we're going to get a briefing on the World Mountain Running Championship scoring event that Kenya is going to host for the very first time. And also expected to happen is that the Trade and Investment Cabinet Secretary, Honorable Salim Mvurya, will officially preside over the UAE Kenya Trade and Investment Forum in Nairobi today. So those are some of the stories that we're keeping a look at. And remember, being a Monday, and for us from the sporting side, is that the National Assembly's Committee on Sport is going to be touring 3 stadia that where works are going on. The Talanta Stadium along Ngong Road, accompanied by Principal Secretary in the State Department for Sport, Engineer Peter Tum, and also the senior officers from the Kenya Defence Forces who are overseeing the construction of that project, the Nyayo National Stadium, and also the Moi International Sports Centre Kasarani in readiness for CHAN 2024 and the AFCON 2027. So right now, we continue with our conversation. It is against anti-doping, and this is not more about the law and the cases that are being there, but also about the science and some of the things that people will always end up seeing whenever a charge is brought, or they need to know to do that. And we are with biomedical scientist Gerald Lwande, who's joining us via Zoom from Eldoret. And Gerald, as we were coming to the close in the previous hour, you brought it out that there is a whole aspect, especially in the case of Mark Otieno, is that when somebody is collecting the samples, you may decide to take some parameters or work within the middle and long distance parameters of anti-doping tests. But in the case of a sprinter, it is different, and just turned out that it was a supplement, how this is connected. Just before we get into how, look at how to work with sprinters, where do you look at the separation of the two parameters for sprinters and for middle and long distance athletes?
Okay, so the reason why we need to separate this is the kind of physiological or muscle recruitment required. So sprinters, even if you look at their bodies, they are more bulky and they need more force because they run very fast in a very short time, less than 10 seconds. Now, on the other hand, for endurance runners, it's between 30 minutes all the way to 2 hours plus. So the kind of muscle requirement and physiological requirements are different. So an endurance athlete needs to breathe in more for a long time. A sprinter needs to hold their breath for the shortest time possible. So same thing can also be applied in terms of sampling. So the sample might be the same, but the parameters being assessed might be different, because for somebody who needs bigger muscles, you might think of growth hormone, you might think of testosterone and such kind of anabolic steroids. On the other hand, for a sprinter, you might think of things that make them lean, like diuretics. You might think of EPO, which helps them breathe more, and other products that are now emerging into the game. Now, when now supplements come into question, the first question we always ask ourselves is, why does an athlete go for supplements? It is a dietary issue, meaning whatever is being provided in diet is not sufficient. Now, most athletes have a diet problem, and this has always been my hypothesis. Their issue is not even a power problem, it is a diet problem. Because try to imagine you wake up very early before breakfast to go to train, you come back for a short break, then again you have another training. So one, you are burning very fast in terms of metabolism, but two, you are not replenishing in equal volume. And most of them live in camps where variety of food is equally not sufficient. So with all these, some thought the best way around it is use of nutritional supplements. But nutritional supplements should not replace diet. That's always my philosophy. So we might also need to begin thinking keenly, what is the diet like? Because the diet for a marathoner versus the diet for a sprinter are totally different. And could we provide this from diet, these nutrients in question from diet as opposed to from supplements, so that in case supplements are to be used, it will be in very low proportions and it won't be like a daily affair. Because what is happening is supplements are not a daily affair to many elite athletes.
Let's just put into that, because the case of diet comes in a lot. If you listen to the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, they've said supplements may not be the way to go, but let's take a look at the diet. First of all, for the middle and long distance runners, because those are the ones that are there. And vis-a-vis our culture of saying, nitakula ugali. Let's take a look at that first.
Okay, so as I mentioned a few minutes ago about the training schedule. So most of our athletes, especially the middle and distance runners, they start their training as early as 5:40 a.m. Now, at such a point in time, very few people have the time to make their breakfast. So some might be on sports drinks which are high on sugar. Some might opt to take breakfast, and some might go dry. Now, this is where the problem begins, going dry. Because you find during training you go dry, but on competition day, you take breakfast. Now, that's a conflict in your system, because your system is used to running without anything. That is the first challenge. The second challenge is immediately after training, it is recommended that within 30 minutes, the athlete takes a high carbohydrate and a high protein diet. Why protein? Because protein metabolizes or burns slowly. So when you're taking something that burns slowly, you won't feel hungry very fast. But when you only take carbohydrates, the case in point that you've said, like ugali, you'll feel very nice within a short time. Unfortunately, after 1 to 2 hours, again, you are hungry. So you'll keep on eating, and it's not easy to cook all that time. So what will somebody do? You'll find them walking around with a sugar-based drink or popping in a supplement or something. So that is where we really need to ring fence in terms of our resource mobilization, in terms of helping them, one, understand what they should eat, and two, quantities and in line with the training. Because again, there are certain products you can't take depending on the kind of training schedule. For instance, if you have a sprint kind of day, like you have to train on the track, if you're a distance runner, You can't take a high acidic diet before training because you'll be producing a lot of lactic acid during training. So we must really customize the diet based on the athlete and based on the training schedule.
Let's talk about now the sprinters and the kind of diets that they have. Actually, before I come to the sprinters, just put it this way, because I think this was from the first breaking 2 attempts. Zersena Tadese would run an entire marathon without taking water. Hydration changed everything. How do you help athletes now adapt to some of these little, changes to something as simple as not taking breakfast, or when they're going for the long run, or taking something, or there are those who actually take just 1 or 2 glasses of water and take off, and then in the competition zone? How do you manage them?
Okay, so athletes come in different forms, just like any human being. So I'll give an example of a retired athlete, Haile Gebrselassie. So Haile Gebrselassie used to lose a lot of water during competition, meaning he would sweat way more than competition. But that was his adaptation mechanism. Or like our athletes, if you were to check, let's say, their heart rate, you'll find it very low. And if you are used to normal human beings, you might say this athlete should go to the ICU. But that is their adaptation mechanism. So the point I'm trying to make here is, one, you must understand which athlete you are dealing with, because their adaptations are different. So then you come to the next point, which is their sugar requirement and even their liquid requirement. Some, if they take liquid, it interferes with their comfort. So you'll hear complaints of stitch and stuff. So you'll find some of them not taking anything at all. But if at all you begin introducing them slowly to it, and the body adapts, and you don't introduce it on the intense training days like the long runs, you introduce it during easy runs, then once the body adjusts to it, then now you can begin in small quantities. And that's why many athletes, especially the very elite ones, train for at least 3 months. So within those 3 months, they have iterated the different interventions, and they know which one works best for which kind of session. Now, we need to genuinely look at the nutritional requirements and the pre, during, and post-competition requirements. Because some people, especially when you're traveling out of the country, you're going to, let's say, to Asia. The diet in Asia is different from the kind of diet we have in Africa. There's also the issue of time zones. So naturally, time zones and the diet will affect how you eat at any given day, because maybe your body still thinks it's daytime, whereas it's night the other side, or your body thinks it's morning, whereas it's evening. So your body really gets confused. And that introduces the importance of acclimation. So if you take a case in point during the breaking 2 and later on the Ineos, you noticed the kind of frequency our athletes were getting their sugar boost, meaning the fluid station. So it was reduced from the normal 5 kilometers to between 2.5 kilometers to 3 kilometers because of the kind of speed they were going at and the kind of sugar requirement. And this was after a lot of trials. If you check right now for one of our elite athletes, he has a sugar patch on him to help him know the exact time he needs to take the sugar and what quantity of that sugar he needs. So technology is also catching up with us on some of these things. Thank you.
Now let's talk about getting ready for the sprinters, because there's a big conversation about sprinters, their diet, and how they need to adapt. How much do we need to do this such that we feed them on the right things? And there's also the conversation about foods that may have being bred with hormones. There are concerns about that, and also some foods that may have been modified one way or another, and the impact is that substance ends up in the bloodstream.
Okay, so maybe the first part I'll talk about is the diet to optimize. So athletes, especially sprinters, they need large muscles. So with the large muscles, you need a high protein kind of diet. So their diet must be high on protein. But now when we come to the competition side of diet, that diet will depend on the number of races you have in a day. Because you realize, like in our international show, whenever we have a single event, we perform way better on the sprints as opposed to having 2 events on the same day. And one of the reasons why we don't perform very well on the second event is power. because sprinters need power. So if you overconsumed your power in the morning or during the morning session, in the afternoon session, you don't have sufficient power. And this can only be sorted through diet. So are you taking the correct mix of protein and carbohydrates based on your needs? And what are your maintenance kind of dose? Like, what do you take in between the main meals? So it's a very dicey thing that you can only customize based on the athlete you are dealing with, because not all of them are equally as muscular. Some are way more muscular, others are slightly leaner. Because if you look at Usain Bolt versus somebody like Gatlin, Usain Bolt looks a little bit leaner in comparison to Gatlin. So most athletes will come in different forms, and the intervention you give is also based on their physique and their desires.
Now let's look at it. And going forward, we know that we are now 3 years into the new WADA code, just another 2 years and there will be revisions made. What are some of the things that the World Anti-Doping Agency is looking at in, one, combating the doping in sports, and number two, adapting to the realities of a changing world with a lot of technology innovations, and at times where even the people who are in advanced countries could be one step ahead of whatever WADA is doing?
Okay, so there are three things that are emerging. One is ethics. So ethics goes all the way to sports technologies, because you find what you just mentioned, advanced countries. So certain countries might have access to certain technologies which athletes from low and medium income countries don't have. So the question is, are we providing a fair playing ground for these two groups of athletes? For instance, if one athlete has the ability to monitor their sugar levels, whereas the other one does not, it creates an unfair competitive advantage. Or even the sports kits.
Yes. Yeah, we are speaking with Gerald Wande. He is a biomedical scientist. He's joining us via Zoom from Eldoret. And looks like there might have been a freeze on that connection. And he was just about to give us
parameters. You might also desire the same parameters, yet you might be wrong.
All right, so Gerald, there was a slight freeze, and so we'd like you to come back and tell us about the three things that you feel really need to be put into place to ensure that over the next 2 years of the current WADA code, we are able to do it. The first one you put was ethics. You could start from that point again.
Okay, so let me summarize first of all. So there are ethics, behavioral science, and genetics. So let me start with ethics. The ethics is a fair playing ground for all athletes, be it in terms of sports technology, be it in terms to access to equipment and training facilities and all those kind of things. The second thing is the behavior. The behaviors that influence an athlete either to participate in clean sports, is whereabouts failures. Whereabouts failures are more behavioral than physiological. So how are we training our athletes to be more disciplined? Because whereabouts is all about being at the scheduled place at the scheduled time. So in the event you miss to be there, it becomes a missed test, or it becomes a test evasion. And then our other challenge in Kenya is always, the joke that's always said is, we don't say the truth during tribunals, which is still a behavioral issue. And that now introduces the mistake of tampering. And you've seen many of our athletes having a tampering problem. Now, the third is now the genetic side. Because I mentioned to you earlier on that this test of athlete biological passport is an indirect test. It does not necessarily show the EPO or whatever product, but it gives a likelihood that you may have used it. But now with genetics, you are able to tell if at all this person used it by checking for the molecular signature. And it doesn't matter whether they used it yesterday or they used it 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago. The molecular signature or the genetic signature will remain on the athlete's system. And that's why you find whenever you've been found to have used EPO, you are given a longer ban, because they say the benefits might stay with you for a longer time. So in summary, it's ethics, it's behavioral science, and it's genetics.
Genetics brings in now something else. It's about the ethics and the trust that people may have. What is it that they may want to study, from here or the other? But how is this being ring-fenced especially such that, because samples are being collected from athletes every day and they're being kept in labs forever. How do you ring fence to ensure that these things are safe?
Okay, so there are two types of consent. There's the individual consent that the athlete gives that allows a batch of tests. But there's also the group consent, whereby that's why before you do any research, you must pass it through an ethics regulatory body. So that ethics regulatory body offers group cover to these athletes. In Kenya, we've even gone an extra mile and introduced the Kenya Data Act of 2019, which governs handling of human and other data. So you can't just run like a whole spectrum of tests on this athlete without following certain ethical requirements. So sometimes they might not go back to the individual athlete to seek additional consent, but the ethics body might check through whatever tests are being proposed and either allow or disallow the use of those samples.
And as we close, one of the things that, we had a conversation some time back, and it is about ensuring that all samples collected have got, their level of integrity is kept at best. We know that there is the possibility of having a laboratory put up in collaboration with the Kenya Medical Research Institute. I won't get into so much details about that, but ensuring that the integrity of any sample collected, especially blood samples, stays safe. How much needs to be done such that it doesn't degrade, or if it's exposed to air or the elements, part of it or whatever is required for all the tests is not damaged?
Okay, so there are existing guidelines, both laboratory-based guidelines and WADA guidelines on transfer of samples. So it depends where the sample is collected, because a sample collected inside a laboratory or close to the laboratory is different from a sample collected in the villages, because you have to ship it over a longer distance. So all the samples, especially when we have, or even the existing ADAC agents, they follow that cold chain requirements for any sample. Then once the sample gets to the lab, again, you have to ensure it adheres to certain good clinical laboratory practices. So there are already guidelines that have already been established. So we are not going to start from scratch. And for facilities like KEMRI, they have been in this game long enough doing other types of research, and they already have working arrangements on how to handle this. Because the only fear always is, and we've had such cases before, that samples could be swapped or samples could be tampered or something like that. But if at all these guidelines are followed, then we should not have any fear for such.
Oh, yeah. Oh, truly enough. I think you mentioned this about supplements, but let me just wind up with this, because supplements are a real thing. We see anybody who goes to the gym for maybe for their own purposes. In other sports, especially explosive sports like rugby, we've seen this in football, and it's also, especially in Europe, it's a very big thing. What's the right way to check, or where would anyone go to check if a supplement is okay and will not land you into trouble? We know cases of 2 athletes in the country who have been sanctioned because of supplements. How do you make sure that you keep checking this? Who's the right body to go to? Where do you look for any certification? And you also mentioned it may be available in Kenya, but if you go to a race in Rome, in Italy, it will not be acceptable.
Yes, so there are websites, I can't say them off my head right now, but there are websites that exist which are either country-specific, in line with the WADA code, or product-specific, especially for supplements. So there are 2 different platforms. So there's one that specifically it's like a supplement checker. I'm sure when guys Google, they can find it. But on the issue of a regulatory side, all this must also be approved by the local agency, in this case, ADAC. So ADAC has on their portal a platform called Therapeutic Use Exemption. So when you go over there, you even indicate which type of supplements you want to take, and they'll tell you whether that is within the allowed panel or not. But there are also websites that can be searched. Maybe at the end of this, I can share with you some of those links, and you can share with the general public.
All right, thank you very much, Gerald. I'm sure we'll share with that kind of information. It's very important that people know that anytime you come into contact with a substance, you are personally liable for it. And also, we can see that in cases, athlete support personnel would be sanctioned for that. Thank you very much, Gerald Luande, for your time this morning, giving us a call from Eldoret. Just looking at the way you're dressed, looks like, you know, the chilly weather has also hit Eldoret.
It's quite windy over here. I had to really keep warm.
All right. Well, it's wet in the capital, Nairobi. Thank you very much, Gerald, for joining us from Eldoret, giving us these insights, you know, especially into little things like diet, what you do with the athlete biological passport and how it's used, plus also, at the end of the day, ethics, making sure that your behavior is right, and at the end of the day, we make sure that we use our science right. Thank you very much, Gerald Luande. Well, we continue with Sports Check this morning. We'll be taking we expect to be joining our team at Athletics Kenya. Daniel Mwendwa is there. We would like to join him later because we've got the president of the World Mountain Running Association, President Tormo Sarf. He is in the country, and he came in this morning.